Welcome to a new season of the Green Pill podcast. We are exploring how technology, community, and new forms of coordination can be used to build, fund, and accelerate what matters in the 21st century. This season, I'm talking with builders, thinkers, and innovators who are pushing the edges of what's possible, from on-chain capital allocation to Ethereum to alignment to reimagining markets and governance. Together, we'll uncover how these ideas can bring us closer to a world that's improving every week, month, or quarter, what we call Protopia, a preferable, realistic future that is constantly improving through small incremental changes over time. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at greenpill.network, or you can download the Green Pill books for free, play with some of our ecosystem projects, join the Telegram, or participate in the network. Alrighty, today I have an episode with Ellie Hain. Ellie is a thinker, writer, and facilitator working at the intersection of culture, meaning, and progress. After creating the widely shared Exit the Void video, she helped catalyze the early work around the Meaning Alignment Institute, which she calls MAI, then shifted from an institutional academic lane into experiential practice, mentoring founders, designing retreats, and giving meaning-driven strategy for ambitious projects. In her recent talks, Ellie frames meaning as an attunement to life, presence, values, beauty, peak experiences, and embodied everyday moments, and argues that meaning is both rooted in tribe, story, ritual, and evolving in cycles of pushing and returning to the center. So, Ellie, I think, is a really interesting thinker and speaker thinking about meaning in the 21st century. And I just talked to so many people in this space who, no matter how successful they are, feel like they're missing meaning, they're missing purpose. And I think that there's a really interesting thread to pull here about what meaning looks like in the 21st century. And Ellie and Joe from the Meaning Alignment Institute, I think, are two of the most articulate speakers that I've talked to that are doing work in discovering how to articulate, how to find meaning, how to look for meaning, how to attune ourselves to looking for meaning. And I think that there's something really beautiful here that I think goes hand in hand with the work that we're doing in the regen space around building mechanisms for allocating capital. But I think that there's a parallel here with how do we allocate meaning, how do we find meaning, and how do we embed it into the things that we're doing. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Ellie, and I think you're going to as well. Hi, Ellie. How are you?
Hi, Gavin. I'm good. So nice to be here. Thank you for
Yeah,
inviting.
really excited for our conversation. I wonder if you could tee us off by telling us about your work exploring meaning in the 21st century.
Huh. Okay, we're starting with the big questions.
Yep, let's
um,
get in.
yeah. So I guess I'll just like tell a bit more about like how I got into this work, because it's a very big theme and kind of like I think the journey illustrates a bit. Like 10 years ago when I was just kind of starting to become an adult and kind of like seeing like how do I face this like big complicated world that we're in. I I had some kind of like initial kind of like very opening sort of like mystical experiences, and I kind of like saw like that there was this like huge gap between kind of like how I felt inside that it was good and then kind of like the paths that like society were like laying out for us. So I was like, okay, am I only 20 and like do I need to kind of like already give up on like my soul and dreams just to kind of like fit in kind of like wherever like narrow box that I'm being told to fit in. And so that kind of like kicked off this like crazy journey, kind of like deep research arc of what really is the nature of the good, the nature of kind of like the things that kind of like really connect us back to life. And these like what's the kind of like felt experience of these things. And then how do systems, large scale systems like markets, democracies, but also kind of like schools and more broadly kind of like different like cultural narratives and like different kind of like social groups and tribes. How do all these human systems, social systems, honor, protect, or dishonor and like work against this feeling of meaningfulness and goodness and like sacredness? And I sort of like went many places for it. At some point, it was kind of like more like deep research and philosophy. That's kind of what built like the backbone of the work that we're doing at my. And then I went into AI because like obviously they're like dealing with these like questions of like what's the nature of the good and how do kind of like very powerful technological systems kind of like empower these and disempower these. And now I kind of after an excursion in that world, I kind of like went back more into how what are the sort of experiences, protocols, visions that kind of like really help connect people to that experience. And then how do we from there like use that connection to kind of like build these like more aligned systems.
It feels like the topic that we're circling here is meaning in the 21st century, alignment between people and purpose. And I know that colloquially in technology circles right now, we talk about alignment a lot in the context of AI, but actually having humans aligned with their purpose, I feel like is maybe a centuries old alignment problem. Is that too reductionist?
No, absolutely not. And it's kind of, I would say that it's like more than purpose. So kind of one lens that I like looking at these is meaning as this like deep attunement and connection to life. And by life, I mean the whole web of life. So it's us and our purpose, but it's also like the tribe, it's the community, it's like the network of communities, and it's the more than human world. So it's like attunement to the earth,
Mm.
and like all her beings. And in these, like I really like looking at it through the lens of kind of like we are like one node in this like huge organism, this like huge system. We're like one cell of this like organism, and in that, there is an intelligence to like that human and like more than human organism, and we all like play a unique part that kind of like our personality and life experience is like perfectly like tuned around like we play this part. And so it's kind of like really a job of like listening and kind of like positioning to like yourself, and it is your purpose, but it's kind of not your purpose and like as your like soul kind of like individual act that you like create, and then you kind of like empower yourself to like defend it. But it's really this like co-created act that you're like doing with yourself, with your tribe, and with the whole of life.
What I think is interesting here is this attunement with, I'm going to call it a superorganism. That's
That's
a word that Nate Haggins uses, which is the entire web of life. And one of the things I think a lot about is the relationship between our sovereignty, which is, my power over my body, my home, my sovereign, ideally sovereign finances, sovereign different parts of my life, and then the interconnectedness and interdependence that comes from being a part of the web of life. And that
Mhm.
duality between the sovereignty and the interdependence, I think is like this liminal space in which we live. And um, Web3, the people who work in crypto and AI that I work with, I think are very focused on sovereignty and complete independence.
Mm. Mm.
But I think we're exploring a perspective of interdependence here that is complementary to the sovereignty, and there's a little bit of a duality there that I haven't totally untangled, but I don't know if you have anything to say about that duality.
I mean, the duality is like part of creation at like every level, right? Kind of like
Mhm.
that's the game that we're playing, and it's good. So it's not something to kind of like be like it's not like either or, but kind of like rather like where is the boundary? So even kind of like we're saying like we're an organism, right? Like that organism is like nested within like other organisms. So like us as individuals, and then like us as part of the tribe that is like another organism, and us as part of this like network of tribes. And that even kind of like the cells in our organism, they're kind of like one node in like a larger organism. They say that reality is fractal. And at each of these levels, there's the boundary that's like defines who you are. And then the kind of like boundariesness, kind of like the field that like connects all of it. I think that just like being aware of like these two nodes and kind of like dancing between them, right? Kind of like, are we doing too much, like sovereignty, like individualistic work at the expense of the interconnectedness? And at the same time, like we've also seen kind of like how the 20th century like really failed us in the sense of kind of like failing the individual, like improv kind of like these like big collective mass, right? So it's always for me this is just like how we learn, and kind of like the answer is always kind of like attunement and like listening, because like when you're kind of like off that like dual feel like too much in like one extreme, like it will feel off, right? Like there will be kind of like a sense of, you know either I'm like becoming like too isolated, or I don't have like enough space. And kind of like as soon as we like start listening to these cues, those are like the opportunities to like not just adjust, but kind of like really refine how we understand this interaction between kind of like the organism and kind of like the nested web into which is it lives.
What does that attunement feel like? I'd like to invoke for myself and for the audience feeling of attunement so that we can vibe on it for the rest of the episode. Is there an easy way to invoke it or to
Yeah.
think about what it
Um,
feels like?
yeah. So maybe you can do this experiment with me, and you can try to connect with a moment in your life that felt really meaningful.
Mm.
I don't know if you feel like sharing, and if not, we can like work without sharing it. But kind of just to kind of give it more like try to invoke this like moment, like this like feeling of like deep meaningfulness,
Mhm.
and kind of how that made you feel like in your body,
Mm.
and how that like created a type of like relating with the world. How did you feel yourself like living in that world? What's the quality of that experience? And what did you feel like it was possible at that time? How did it feel like it was possible to relate to yourself, to others, to the world? And now, do you feel like you have that? Do you have that with you, Kevin?
Yes.
So maybe like I want to like link it back. So now we've like gone through like a very, very, very meaningful experience, but maybe try to think now of a meaningful experience that you've lived in the past days or the past week. So something that feels like more casual, more ordinary, doesn't need to be anything spectacular, but like something that kind of like also brought up this feeling of like meaningfulness, and how that made you feel and what felt possible by being in that experience. Which sort of life felt possible. So we have that.
Yep.
Usually I do this exercise in different groups. I've done it several times now, and it's really beautiful. And then like people share experiences, and sometimes they're just kind of like really big experiences. Also, sometimes, funnily enough, there's also kind of like quite difficult and like challenging experiences. People share about like the death of a loved one, or kind of like a deep moment of like pain and transformation. And also just kind of like very small, like casual moments, like a walk, with their wives, or, just kind of like a smile from their kids. And I think kind of my reflection out of these is that this experience of attunement is presence. And there's big moments in our life, ecstatic moments of like great beauty, that they're kind of like boom, they're like snapping back us into presence. But in a way, presence is always like a choice that we can kind of like have in every moment. And when we're doing that, when kind of like we're choosing to be present, it's funny because um just by doing this exercise, I noticed that like I started kind of like really fast and like mental, and now the energy of the conversation has like dropped.
It's more
You know,
embodied.
it's more embodied, it's slower. We're kind of like that's the attunement, right? Like attunement has like meaning. Sometimes they like meaning, truth, attunement. They have like a resonance, and it's like an embodied resonance, right? And like when we're like paying attention to that, it's like it's how life is guiding us towards what's good, towards like what's true for us. It's not always what's easy, right? Because like sometimes there's like the transformational thing that kind of like really confronts you with like how you're been doing, things wrong. But like it really kind of like it's what deepens us. And it's also for me kind of like the force of evolution, right?
One of the things I find so impressive about you, and especially your backstory, is that your interrogation of this very for me, it still feels a little bit hard to grasp, but your grasping of this realization that maybe our modern world, our contemporary world, there's meaning missing, or you have to go looking for the meaning, and the intuition to go seek it out and to look for it is, I think a very teachable skill, and I think that's one of your gifts, Ellie, is your
Mhm.
ability to seek that out and to teach that to others. And so in a way, there's maybe like a fractal meaningness to you teaching other people, being more tuned into meaning and purpose.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you. You know, I don't really think that I'm teaching. I would say that if anything, I'm reflecting. Like meaning for me is like the life force, right? Like it's just kind of like it is our birthright. Kind of when we're like in a healthy context, like in a kind of like how humans have lived for like many years, right? Kind of like connected to the earth and like in a tribe, with like ritual, with community, with like the cycles of life, like that is inherently meaningful. And this is like how this like whole human like makeup is made for. So it's not, however, for many reasons, we've kind of, a society has like strayed away from kind of like this like very basic kind of like fundamental experience of like being human, and now is a process of kind of like re-remembering, but kind of that remembering is not something for me that kind of you have to like strive for and like learn, but kind of is really just like being reminded that like no, like at some point I say like we humans, we have these kind of like natural sensors towards what's good and true and beautiful, and our job is to like resensitize ourselves to like feel that again, and also to believe that we can live like that we deserve to live like that, right? And that it's not kind of like, oh, we're like so privileged in this kind of like modern world with like so much like bullshit abundance, and kind of like also being like, oh, like that is not really what kind of like what the whole human experience is, and believing that there is more to that, that we have the capacity for it, is for me, it's actually like quite, is like both like the biggest thing and also like the most natural thing. And everyone that I spoke to, from kind of, like super high performing founders and, like really successful people, to kind of older people, to like the most normie of the normie, like they all resonate with these, because it's just kind of like, yeah, like this is like the most human thing there is.
Where I want to take us is meaning in the 21st century. So, why is it so hard to find meaning in our contemporary world? Why is there people in the liminal web call this the meaning crisis? People are feeling a lack of purpose, and I feel like I see this in friends that I know in the space who are struggling with their careers, but I also find it with people who are massively successful and have built multi-million-dollar protocols. And even outside of tech, I think I see it with my friends outside of tech. Why is there a meaning crisis? Why is it so hard to find meaning in the 21st century?
Um, we could like just spend like 2 hours on this, but um, what's the compressed version? I think a compressed version is that we try to build, I think like humanity, like as we are, we're always like experimenting with like different modes of like social organization, right? And usually like these modes, when like a new mode comes about, say like when modernity came about, is like highly meaningful and like functional. But then as time passes and like as things continue to scale, and just like the force of entropy starts, makes it so that kind of like the games that it like these first created, they were like functional and meaningful, they stop being so functional and they stop being so meaningful. So now we're like in these sort of like in between worlds, right? We're kind of like the whole modern, postmodern paradigm, they're like very obviously collapsing. But there's like not yet kind of like real alternatives that are kind of like fully built and legible. So if you're like one of these like pioneers, you kind of like have to like go out on your own, and you have to like navigate this like world of, traps, like schemes that they're kind of like promising you meaning, but kind of like not really selling it. So it's a very complicated situation on like many levels. That's kind of like more on like the like broad social analysis, like institutional level. Then there's the fact that because it is like quite hard to live in this sort of society, and it's actually like it's not just this sort of society. We have been, there's kind of like centuries and centuries and generations of like life being very hard,
Mhm.
right? Even kind of like before pre-modern age, and like before like empires and like wars and all that sort of stuff. And when things get very, very hard, the kind of like the human response is to kind of like protect yourself from that hardship by like building a sort of like numbness, like desensitizing yourself to it, just so you can kind of like push through things. And that's a good protective mechanism because it allows you to survive. But it's very bad for being like sensitive to this like whole like web of life thing that we're talking about, which is essential to kind of like being attuned to meaning.
Mhm.
So there's this kind of like inner desensitization with kind of like systems that like even when they're like more or less functional, they're still kind of like built on that desensitization. And then there's, you can kind of like go on so many other things, from like how the school system is like built to enforce that, and kind of like create like obedient and compliant workers and citizens instead of kind of like actually like meaning driven individuals, to like the whole kind of like bad parenting practices and just kind of like a lineage of like intergenerational like pass on trauma that kind of like perpetuate these cycles, to the fact that, you know, modernity like completely even kind of like coming from a good place, but like created this kind of disenchantment, right? And kind of like placed us in a world that is apparently like dead, and like we're kind of like soul individuals kind of like floating through space, and you know there's nothing more to life than that. So it's just this like completely like stacked um level of problems, with the added challenge that now on top we're kind of like really seeing how like all these things are failing us. And then you add into the mix like exponential tech and climate change and kind of like AI distracting us, and kind of like the potential like, you know, loss of jobs and like all these sort of threats. So we're like extremely agitated, and we're like dealing with like a very like heavy legacy. And on top, there's like no good yet established like legitimate paths, which means that we're really strong. And like the fact that we're actually like doing, you know, that we're still here and like that these conversations are happening just is a proof of like how like strong and like how committed we are to kind of like actually like as a species to like figuring out alternatives. And I'm quite hopeful of like us being able to like get out at least of like the meaning maze, right? Because in a way, something that I've learned in my research into meaning is that like challenge is like only fuel. Like once it's kind of like when you're like looking at challenge and you kind of really decide to like go through it, it's just fuel to kind of like go deeper and kind of like really integrate a much more fuller and complex, deeper expression of life. So I think like as we go through these, it will be beautiful, but kind of like and it will be like hugely transformative for us as individuals and for us as a society. But we have to go through these. And right now it is hard, and there's kind of like no easy answers.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of my takeaways from your answer, which I found like, you know, beautiful and had lots of threads that I could pull in it, is I feel like the default setting, if you're just sort of like daydreaming through life, is that meaning is hard to come by. But it feels like one of those things that once you become attuned to it and you learn to seek it and you bootstrap it in yourself and you start to get connected to a friend group that's attuned to it, that it is possible to find, but it's just not built into the default happy path in a lot of our economic spaces or our community spaces in the 21st century.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting because something that has been like really true for me is that the more I kind of like follow this path, the better my life has become in like such obvious magical like synchronistic kind of like blow your mind sort of ways. And I don't think this is because I'm special like at all, because I've seen this happen to also the people around me, right? And it was like, no, we're just kind of like tapping into like what life is, not that life could be, but like life is actually, if we allow it to be like that, if we don't like shield ourselves from it, you know, from this magic. And these, what I've seen in me and also others around me, like it's not just that it's like brought this magic, but it has made me much, much, much more capable to like face challenges. It's made me more ambitious, kind of like less easy to kind of like fall for, you know, like easy bullshit, to be scared, you know, to kind of like be anxious. There's this and in a way it kind of like once you like tap into this stream, it feels, my experience of it, that it is an intelligent stream, and that it will kind of like slowly like bring you and kind of like organize your lives to kind of like maximize meaning for you and like for those around you, right? And it's really just a job of like being committed and listening and kind of like keep showing up for it. But if you've never seen anything like that, and even kind of like me, I remember before, you know, I went to law school, and when all my like openings, I'm like, oh my God, what is this world sort of thing started, I dropped out. And I'm from Spain. I'm from like a very, you know, I grew up in a very conservative background where, you know, it's absolutely unthinkable that like someone would like not go to university or like have a college degree at all. And it was funny because I was like, no, I want to do meaningful things, and kind of like talking to people and like seeing how people have built like their whole like belief structure and their whole way of like navigating, you know, through the world in sort of like to defend themselves from the realization that it doesn't have to be like that. And it's so painful because like when I would confront them, you could see kind of like their whole like belief system like shattering and like the violence that comes from that. Because if we allow ourselves to like really feel like the fact that like how we've like spent our life and how we built our society is like terribly bad, not just for ourselves, but kind of like for the collective as a whole, it's just a really painful thing. It's like a really painful realization. So I think those are kind of like the two sides of the same coin, kind of in a way, like how good life can be, but also like how painful it is the fact that we have not been living like this. And and I think kind of on the other thing, like we do need a lot of people who embody these and who kind of like with maximum humility like be there as an inspiration for others that like no, there are actually other ways, and these ways like you can still be capable and function in the world and like accomplish things and be creative and like live in community and that they can do that and kind of like display that to the rest of the world.
And, I think that when I'm sitting around and talking with regen, Web3 mechanism designers, institution designers, I think the dream is to create new institutions, or let's call them extitutions, because maybe they're not even institutions at this point, that not only have that functional quality that's really valuable from an economic perspective in contemporary life, but also have the ability to imbue meaning and purpose into those participants. And I feel like that, to me, that's the holy grail as a mechanism designer.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. This is the work that me and Joe from the Meaning Alignment Institute and Oliver and Ryan and others, amazing team of like researchers and builders have been working towards for a long time. And it's funny because sometimes when you go down these like road of like, oh, meaning is all there is and like purpose and like connection to life, it's beautiful and it is true, but sometimes it can also be like a bit like individualistic or like inwards focused. And the truth is that we live in like large scale societies, and large scale societies need large scale solutions and systems. So it might be the case that like some people can just kind of like float through this crisis with kind of like their own like homestead and kind of like very meaning heavy like practices. I don't think that's how we collectively like get out of this. Um, so in terms of like, what is this kind of like effort to like build new institutions and how they can be like meaning aligned, for me, kind of like where I landed and where we landed with the institute is like, I think there needs to be some like basically like institutions. They're kind of like about human systems, and they have like embedded in at their center a conception of like human nature. And up until I was going to say up until recently, but like even still today, officially, the conception of like human nature that like most institution and like mechanism designers design by is kind of like the homo economicus, the rational utility maximizing agent.
Yeah.
Nothing about meaning, nothing about values, nothing about beauty, nothing about community, right? An isolated individual trying to kind of maximize their gains and their outcomes individually. So this like theory is like at the center of how we build the world. And then like, no surprise that this is like the world that we got. So I think if I was to say like what are the keys for this like new effort in institution building, is like new theories, m- like legitimate theories, kind of like theoretical systems that like actually have the rigor, like equal rigor as like the previous theories, but that have a much more holistic, whole, like deep understanding of what humans are. And these like shout out to the amazing work that they're doing at the Meaning Alignment Institute, trying to really like create like the theoretical foundations of the shift. And then so that's the theory. And the theory is like so needed and it's amazing, but there's also kind of like the place that people are creating from. Because how I understand it, and like also what I've seen, all the systems that we create, and actually like everything that we create, they're just like really like expressions of like what we have inside. So numb, desensitized, isolated people will create numb, desensitizing, isolating systems. So yes, we do need the new set of theories, but we also need this like new set of like sensitivities, both from like the people who are like building like the theoretical frameworks, but especially from the builders, from the leaders, from the founders, from the VCs, all this like new elite that like really has this like huge responsibility in their hands. And you cannot ask them to like take responsibility for like absolutely everything, because that's impossible. But you can ask them to take the responsibility for like really what is the place that you're doing this from? How connected to like the full extent of life are you really? And in these, I do have this like vision dream, like part of what I feel called is to like work with like all these people and like create a sort of like communal containers where we can all like tap in into this life force, into this meaning, and then together make the commitment to like, yes, this is what we're standing for. And we're like help each other to kind of protect this thing.
As you're talking, a lot of the concepts from Exit the Void are flashing in
Mm.
my mind. And just to introduce that artifact to the audience, this is a video that you and others produced, I think about 4 years ago, and published on the Stoa's YouTube, about a movement for meaning. What would it mean to recognize how meaning's been corrupted and the containers for meaning have been corrupted, and to transcend that in the 21st century? So I'm going to drop a link to that video in the show notes, but it's another, I think, very nicely produced artifact of the meaning crisis and how to think about it. And I think that's how I discovered your work. It's really incredible storytelling, and I hope there's more artifacts like that coming.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of work, but it also was at a time where my mind didn't like really have the theories, but kind of like the whole kind of like attunement and like doing being able to like produce ambitious work. I didn't quite have it as practice as I did. So God, I remember the whole production was it did take a lot of me. Um, but yeah, what was your
The,
question regarding the video?
Well, I think I was just wanted to share Exit the Void with the audience, was the primary
Yeah.
intent there. But the concept from Exit the Void that I'll bring to this conversation is this idea of containers for meaning being separate from the meaning themselves. And this was a new concept to me when I first learned about it, but basically this idea that, the sources of meaning that humanity have might be something like connection with a loved one, or connection with nature, or connection with the divine, and these get put into containers that deliver them. Like for nature, it might be a park, or with the divine, it might be a church, or even like a mega church, or friends and family might be work or church or other community containers. And this idea that containers can be corrupted, I think, really resonated with me as they get sort of captured by their KPIs and or like certain individuals, and don't serve the meaning that they had anymore. So it just felt like that was a useful thing to bring to the conversation. Is what do the new containers look like that are either uncorruptible or are better containers for meaning than the ones that we've inherited from previous generations?
Yeah, just to kind of maybe like clarify, like containers, they're really like not like bad or good. They're just like the vehicle of like creation, right? So kind of like there's a space of like experience and like potentiality, and then kind of like that needs to be like expressed in a vehicle, in a container. Um, but in that expression, like that's kind of like when things can sometimes get corrupted. So especially after time passes and like scale passes, because like entropy will do its job, and then that's when corruption is most likely to happen. Yeah, so like in terms of containers for meaning in the 21st, is that what you're asking me?
Yeah.
You know, the more I reflect on these, and and I'm someone that like has spent like the past years kind of like deep in tech, and the Meaning Alignment is like an AI research institute, and we're doing this like crazy research on like artificial super wisdom that like is able to kind of like um broker win-win negotiations, and these like meaning economies, and like all these kind of like very elaborate like big schemes. And I think they're beautiful, and I do think that they're like part of the movement that like we collectively are like part of, and that kind of like life is like moving towards, right? Technology and big systems, like yes. But then even kind of, or perhaps because I've been spending like so much time around these, I think something that I like really kept coming back to, kept realizing, was that like our makeup as humans is not like, it's not that different that kind of like the humans that kind of like lived in the Paleolithic, like many years ago. And that like the makeup for like meaning was created then, the makeup for like health, right? So in this sense, like meaning is lindy. Like there's kind of like a few things that there's a few things that repeatedly like make people's lives meaningful, right? And this is like being around loved ones, feeling seen by those loved ones, being part of a community that like you feel like you have like a role in it, that you have like purpose. Because it's like purpose is not an isolated thing. It's like something that you're like bringing as an act of service to these loved ones, and to feel that like those others are there to like support you and to see you in that quest, and that you're like mutually like supporting each other. And that just as you're part of this like community, you're also like part of like a larger community of this like more than human world. We are like part of the earth, right? Like we are part of kind of like the natural systems. We are like a part of kind of like all the animals that are there, and even kind of like the ancestors and like the new generations. And this kind of like really like the whole universe of like potential, right? And of like this great mystery that we're just like one part of it. And things as simple as telling good stories, and like singing and dancing together, and kind of like ritually like engaging periodically in like threshold experiences, right? Like experience that like push us to our edge and kind of like reshape our consciousness so we can come back to center, like more aligned. These like more like primitive, like indigenous things, they're just kind of like so embedded in like who we are as humans that they're just like, I'm not necessarily like a paleo dieted person, but I like do appreciate kind of like where like things are like taking shape in their um argument. I think that like I would say like those are like the basic containers of
Mhm.
meaning. So when I think like how does that look in the 21st century, I think like, okay, which are the sort of community structures, like guilds, like new, because the truth is that, now we live in a like globalized world. And yes, some people might choose to kind of like settle down with just kind of like a few people, and that will be their village and that will be their community. But like for many of us, that's not the case. I live between like, I don't know, like 5 different places right now, right? Like my tribes are like spread all over, and they're like my tribe, right? So kind of like how do you delineate the boundary? But still like these phenomenon like still needs like a sense of like tribe and like organization. Even the fact that now we have like in terms of like purpose, right? Like I keep meeting, like fellow, like sisters and like brothers in arms. You're one of them, but like I've had the honor and pleasure of like meeting many others. So like are there sort of like guilds, right? Like associations that kind of like are really there to like empower those individuals and to kind of like make them feel that they're like working for something greater than like any of themselves, and they're like supported in that bigger task. In terms of like new like rituals and experiences and kind of like collective threshold ecstatic moments. I've lived in Berlin for many years, so kind of like I the whole raving thing. And I could see, it's funny because sometimes people from the outside, like they just see it as a party thing, but like inside the raving community, there's like a very like big sort of like political consciousness, right? As in like we are doing something different. And there's like something very prominent about that. So I think there's just like, or like all the kind of like new festivals that are emerging. So I think there's like a lot of movement in that direction, that kind of like we're all like tapping into this, like the desire for like community, the desire for like stressful experiences, for ritual. We're like all tapping into this field and expressing differently. I don't think that like anyone, I haven't yet seen something that like it's exactly that, like you've got all the solution. And I don't think it's about that. But I do see the energy. And then maybe kind of like what I would say last is that like all these things happen. There's like these like cohesive field has how like society is like organized around these fields were like through shared story, a story that kind of like names all those things and names the role that you play in these things and how you're supposed to kind of like go around it. So I think that's also something that there's no like coherent story for these like no emerging yet. There's kind of like many different voices, but like that's also something that I'm expecting to see, and probably it will be like all these different voices, like all of us like creating these like stories and like reviving old stories. um yeah, I think it's a very exciting time.
Yeah. Well, I hope that people out there who are building new institutions in Web3 will take a look at this work, and I think there's there's a lot of interesting things that I want to take away from what you said, but the primary one here is not designing for homo economicus and designing for homo sapiens, designing for meaning, and that means revisiting the parts of meaning that are lindy and that have evolved into our civilization for millennia. I'm curious if, as we're going into closing, if there's anything I didn't ask that you want to say, if there's anything else in your body of work that you feel like is present and that you want to bring to this audience.
Yeah, I guess I just wanna, I think I said this, but I wanna like re-highlight it. I do think that this is the biggest work that can be done this century, right? This kind of like real, it's like the most epic quest that like we could possibly do as humans. And it's a quest that's like not just about like progress, and it's like not just like about yourself. It's about like really like deepening this connection with life and kind of like what is possible actually, like redefining, deepening like what it means to be human. And um in this quest, I see that like all the challenges that we're now facing, they're just like invitations to kind of like look for the diamonds, kind of like what are these hiding, right? Like what may have we missed? Because kind of like as we go through them, that's kind of like where like the new learning, where the new opportunities, like the new visions like come from. And it's not about some, something, there's something that kind of like I've been in discussion sometimes with people, because when you're doing this like large scale work of like designing like new institutions and like new paradigms, sometimes we think it's about like avoiding all the negative consequences and like all the pain. And sometimes like you first need to kind of like feel them and like confront that directly, just so you can like metabolize and like build a new thing. So I would say to people who are listening, like what is that for them? Right? Kind of like what is the edge? Like where is this like the challenge, like the darkness, like the pain, and kind of like what might this challenge be trying to tell us? Because that's where the diamonds are. And and then I would say that really like if once you do this work with kind of like full commitment and devotion, in a way the work takes care of you, because it is bigger than you and it does take care of you. And when you do that, life does become like beautiful and magical in completely unexpected ways. And um, it offers like a new paradigm for being a builder, for like ambition, for kind of like collective projects that I think it's kind of both much more exciting, much more human, but like equally, if not more, like ambitious and grand as kind of like the default kind of like Silicon Valley like startup road. And that I know that there's kind of not a proper like ecosystem for this established, but this is something that we're working on, and that I believe that like also like Gitcoin might be able to kind of like pioneer this new sort of ecosystem. So yeah, to believe in it.
Yeah, I think that the more that I travel on this journey, I think I'm 8 years into Gitcoin at this point. The more I'm learning that the skills that I learned when I was learning computer science and software are only going to get me a very small portion of the way. And there's a lot of learning about history and society and community and listening and sense making that I wish I'd known about when I was younger. But hey, better late than never.
Yeah, yeah. And also this is not like a learning that like you're supposed to do on your own, you know? Like we're supposed to kind of like discover together and inspire each other and kind of like really like build and feel this together. So um
Well, one of the things I think that is an intersection between my work and your work, I was thinking about this the other day while I was prepping for this episode, is if new mechanisms are going to be used to allocate capital to the commons, we're going to make sure the commons are funded and that there's, energy flowing through them. But we're also sort of looking for meaning and looking for ways to discover meaning. It felt like maybe there's a way to bundle both of those in rituals and community containers in such a way that they can complement each other and feed off of each other. The sort of like software, the neo mechanisms for allocating capital that we're creating can be coupled with, I want to call it meaning allocation, but that feels almost like true utilitarian. And so I think that there's an interesting overlap in the design space, and I hope that we come up with something that's useful and exciting there. But I think this is the start of that journey.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. For sure, and I would love to kind of, like, properly explore this in depth, just to make sure that I understand, your question. So, you feel that there's kind of, like, a possible kind of meaning allocation mechanism that also kind of, like, because I've been thinking about the meaning allocation and how would you do it, but I did not think of kind of, like, the more, like, ritual, kind of, like, collective experience aspect. Are you saying that there's a possible intersection there?
I think that there's a Venn diagram there and that there's an intersection there, and I want to discover what it is. I think rituals, in which we come together and we figure out what matters,
Mm,
um,
of course.
is a possible way that we uh,
Yeah.
allocate money and meaning together in a coupled way.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
wasn't a question; it was maybe more of a provocation.
yeah.
As we're closing,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, things like this have been done in like, tribes and, like, indigenous societies, like, forever, because like, they had resources and they had to kind of decide how to allocate the resources. There's even these, yeah, I think, like, a format, like, saving pools thing where, like, people come together and they kind of, like, share their stories, and that's how they decide. So I think there's, like, a lot of, um, like, already, like, material out there, and I think it's also about something that I've been thinking, kind of really making sure that individuals are in, like, their, like, unique place in their, like, web of life. So kind of like these, like, purpose-aligned individuals that kind of, like, really have, like, ramifications all over their community is a big part of what I feel is, um, important in terms of, like, meaning allocation. Yeah.
well, there's more to discover there, and maybe we'll ship something together in the future. But for now, I should get back to my primary job as podcast host, which is wrapping up the episode.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so Twitter is the best place. It's, at Twitter/Ellie__Hain, Hain. Um And yeah, I look forward to see what comes out of these, and excited about what you're building, the interactions between, like, our visions and, like, your whole community.
Same. Well, if you're listening to this episode and you're feeling more attuned, then check out Ellie on X, and there's a link in the show notes. I also put a link to the Exit the Void video in the show notes, which I highly recommend checking out. Thanks so much, Ellie. Appreciated the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It was lovely to be here.
Okay, we just heard from Ellie Hain, really inspired by Ellie because I think that she's really attuned into how to search for meaning in the 21st century. And I feel like she's a teacher that is teaching me how to look for it in my own lives. And I hope that you, as a listener, gained a couple nuggets of wisdom about that as well. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you check out the links in the show notes, and to learn more about Greenpill at greenpill.network. If you value what we're doing, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast and share it with a friend. Until next time, keep building, keep experimenting, keep coordinating. Peace and love. Goodbye.